Okay, so yeah, let me introduce this brief topic that I call characteristics. And it's an analytical tool to think about the change in the composition of demand in a growth context without having to get lost in this insanity of confusing our preferences with national income account. So you may know that there is a literature that goes under the name of structural change. Now, part of that literature is quite interesting from an historical perspective as a descriptive thing. The process of economic growth, for obvious technological reason in some sense, goes from a transition from a world in which 90% of the people work in agriculture and a minority worked in some collateral services, blacksmith, artisans, things like that, to progressively more people working in manufacturing and industry and then services, and increase the number of goods that go through market, reduction in home production, right? Blah, blah, blah. And a tendency eventually of very advanced economies of having very little employment in agriculture, 1, 2, 3% of the workforce, a fairly small employment in traditional manufacturing and industry. Right now in the United States, employment in manufacturing is less than 10%. Right? That's 10% of total employment is in manufacturing. Okay? And so on, and it grows an extension of what we call the service. If you think of it for a moment, you realize that most of it is actually pure labeling, right? It's pure labeling. In what sense the food you eat is the product of manufacturing, service, or the primary sector? It's completely due to the technology you adopt. In the old days, there was no manufacturing almost entering the production of food because the technology was basically, in Italy they would say kilometer zero. Right? It was from the producer to the consumer. The farmer would raise the cow, kill the cow, butcher the cow, cut the cow, and sell you the cow. Right? Everything was integrated production, was vertically integrated. Right? It went from the primary to the tertiary, and they would even cook the cow for you, sometimes. All right? The fact that you separate, and then it becomes efficient to separate it, it's purely a product of technology. So one way to go is to think of that as the old Adam Smith intuition, that there is this interplay between market size and technology that leads to an increase in division of labor. So one way of looking at technological development, to take a very extreme abstract view, is to think of population being extremely heterogeneous. Every individual is different from another. There is a sense in which every individual has its own comparative advantage, and technological progress division of labor is that thing for which each person eventually is able to work and concentrate production in its comparative advantage. But this is also a silly story because what my comparative advantages are is very endogenous. Right? It depends on what I try to dedicate myself when I'm young, when I get trained, when I study, at the early period, the formative period of my life, and that will depend on the technology. So the interplay between what my comparative advantage is and what the technological possibilities is very mixed. What I mean to say with that is that the classification of goods of sector between primary, secondary, and tertiary is a statistical thing, which may be useful for national income accounts. I don't think it's useful anymore. The only thing useful there is to have classification of industries and sector by technological affinity. That's the only thing we care. That's the only thing we care, right? I care that when one says output of sector J, that's computed by summing output, employment, and whatever among firms that more or less use the same technology and produce the same basket of goods. Because that helps me to understand if there is change there, if there is that particular technology is growing or not, how much investment, what, if labor productivity is probably homogeneous in that sector because those firms are competing. That's why I want to classify them. There's no other reason. There is no particular meaning in saying the sector X belongs to services, right? You see what I mean? So this idea of structural change having to be a theory that explains the transition from consumption of agricultural good to consumption of manufacturing good to consumption of services is a bit of a, from the point of view of economic theory, it makes no sense. It's just a statistical artifact. A more interesting way of thinking of it, in my opinion, is one that takes the basic economic notions as given. The basic economic notion we use is that people have preferences. Okay? If we want to be complicated, we define them like that. Right? Or, thank you for the bread, another, we define over a set of something, some utility function over something. So think about what the utility function over something is. If you try to think of it independently of the technology, that is, if you try to think a utility function over something that defines your preferences, your father's preferences, your grandfather's preferences, and maybe your grandfather's preferences. So if you start doing economic growth in the long run, you try to compare and make a choice, you can talk about yourself and you can talk about Julius Caesar, and there's actually a sense in which you compare your preferences with this. But then at the end of the day, it seems to me, I may be wrong, but my intuition says that what you care is about being fed, drinking, shelter, having a good time, laughing, having social status, moving around the world safely and quickly, keeping up the good health, and so on, okay? You're essentially caring about a set of characteristics of things that produce feelings and pleasure to you, right? The entertainment mechanism, think about that. People used to entertain themselves. There is the demand for the happiness, partying, drinking, dancing, right? It's clearly been across cultures. It seems to be a component of our brain and of what makes feel us good, right? That is carrying across culture. It finds expression in slightly different phenomena, but they're very similar. People dance, people drink, people sing, people, act out things, right? It's very, and the difference has been the technology. The number of sagre and village parties and blah, blah, blah is reduced, and people watch a lot of crap on TV. Yeah, but they're all looking for the same stories, right? They're all looking for the romantic thing and the hero and the guy on the horse and she's blonde and he's beautiful and then there is the good guy and then the bad guy and then he dies and then he resurrects and then he comes back and there is vendetta. They're all the same, no? It's not meant to disparate. Some are better done, some are done worse. The Count of Monte Cristo is fascinating. The modern silly version in soap opera is probably idiotic and boring, but that's the quality of the artist. At the end, they're telling the same story. Right? That's what I call a characteristic. So I like to think that one possibility is to define utility over a vector C that I consume at time t, and Ct is a vector of characteristics. I take the name and the theory, in fact, from Lancaster. Lancaster was a microeconomist, very nice. I used to be at Columbia for a long time. I don't think he's alive still. If he is alive, he's very, very old, but I think he's gone. Okay? They used it in part for static consumption theory. In fact, if you do applied work and you look at people doing quantitative marketing, they use a lot of this. So this is not my particular idea. Okay? I'm not claiming this is Baudrillard. I'm copying, I'm imitating, but I'm saying it should be used in development theory to understand technological change better than we do, okay, even. So hedonic prices, for example, are derived by that. One thing you do in hedonic price theory, both when you apply to labor theory or when you apply to consumption good, is take a good and break down its price according to its characteristics, right? People that sell you cars play with hedonic prices all the time, right? They give you the base model price and then they start adding the roof, the moon roof, the premium speakers, the leather seat, the heating of your butt, or whatever. All the fun, and each one of them has a price. And those prices are hedonic prices. They've been trained on thousands of consumers before you, knowing, people tend to buy that stuff if I offer it at $600, okay? So they charge you 620 and try to see what they can get, right? So it's not a particular new thing. But in growth, I think it's useful because the key is the vector characteristic we care about is finite. And it is time invariant. Again, it is only partly time invariant. It's obvious that the set of values that Julius Caesar obeyed or anybody in China 2,000 years ago followed is different from yours. But not so different. It's a lot less different than the set of consumption goods you're using. Okay? So one way of doing this is to assume that this is so. This is a vector in Rn. And goods or commodities are completely a different things. A commodity is anything. There is an infinite number of possible commodities. And a commodity I is representable as a vector of characteristics. Okay? So commodity I, when I consume 1 unit of it, 1 unit of commodity I gives me Ci. Ci1 to Cin. Right? That's what makes commodity I different from commodity J. It's just a different bundle of characteristics. Okay? An apple and a pear are two commodities. They have some entries in common, but they have some flavor or some shape, some color entry that is different. To the extent that that matters for your utility, that's a characteristic. Okay? That's what makes a commodity different from another. That the vector of characteristics that they have is different. So the bicycle is different from a motorbike because they have a set of things in common, but clearly one has an engine, the other does not. One requires fatigue, the other doesn't. One requires gas, and that provides you with different level of satisfaction, different uses. That's what it makes a good different from another. If you take that perspective, then the process of economic development is actually a process through which you travel through innovation across the commodity space by changing commodities. We will see how next week. And the demand side is one that says, you're suggesting commodity J instead of commodity I to satisfy my characteristic. Let me see. And the let me see becomes, how much does it cost to get the satisfaction of a vector of characteristics with this set of commodities or with the other sector? Oh, sorry, with the other vector. I don't know why I said sector. With the other vector. Okay? So I'm always trying to satisfy the same thing. With the damn phone, with the people, right? They're doing the same thing that they used to do when they went to the village square and talked to the people or sat at the bar. They're just trying to entertain. It's like going to the movie. I'm just doing it with a different commodity. Right? When I make the phone call, it's the same thing when I used to scream across or send a pigeon with a message or a mail right? And so on. The taking picture and showing picture of yourself to the other, they're all the same thing that we've been doing for centuries. What we're doing is changing the commodities with which we perform. Is this useful? To me it's useful for two reasons. One, because it simplifies a lot the problem. Because one of the difficulties that this structural literature has is that either it falls in a triviality. Yeah, I mean, by definition, technological change and development means you go from being a farmer to having a lot more services and being a nuclear physics professor proving theorems, right? So there's nothing particularly surprising in observing that, you know, a very underdeveloped country will have a lot of output in agriculture because that's the primitive technology everybody has, and a very advanced country will have lots of output in services. So that's not very interesting. There's nothing surprising about that, right? Or when it starts to get into the details of the thing, it's going to become very convoluted because things move from one sector to another. It's unclear where it goes. Moreover, given that everybody's obsessed with balanced growth, obviously this is a problem. Because by definition, if you use a classification of sectors in primary, secondary, tertiary, growth is not balanced. Right? And so you continuously have to play tricks to make this abstract idea, this not so useful idea of balanced growth, the way we saw it, it's essentially commodities keep the same ratio, with the reality of the fact that there's no balanced growth in what we observe once you define that. If I think in terms of characteristic, maybe there is balanced growth, maybe there is not, but I don't really need it, right? I don't really need it because there is no need to have a law in how the basket of characteristics I consume evolve. It will depend on their relative prices, and that's it. There's nothing that why should I be consuming a constant ratio between entertainment, proteins, alcohol, sex, reading, shelter? No reason, right? There's no reason that my balancing of this will have to be constant over time. If the relative prices of one or the other changes, I'll go for that. There's nothing surprising in the fact that the demand for health services in general is increasing. Right? It's in some sense the ultimate commodity, and to the extent that getting your body better and living longer and safely becomes cheaper, I'll go for that. Right? But again, it's a characteristic. You see what I mean? You think of the expansion of the health sector, it's essentially the expansion of something that once upon a time was mostly home production. You go back 300 years, the amount of market-provided health services is microscopic. I mean, there was a pharmacist, the doctor was some strange guru that would probably do more damage than good to you. So mama and the grandma were more useful as doctors by saying, okay, take a sleep, drink something, you know, get yourself better. Okay, so that's one use. Another is a practical use, because let's start thinking about this. So if each commodity is just a vector of characteristics, then if I have a vector xt of commodities that are produced, I can think of this vector as belonging always to an infinite dimensional space. So it's always an infinite dimensional vector with entries x1 at time t, x2 at time t. Each one of them is a good, xn at time t, and so on, xn plus 1. Right? This is infinite dimension. So these are all the possible commodities I can introduce over time. At any time, at any finite point in time, only some of them will be produced. Which means after a certain point, after a certain index n, there will be zeros. And there might be zeros also before. I no longer produce that particular brick that they use in Crete, 4,000 years ago. I no longer produce that particular kind of linen that was, of use in 1500, no longer produced, and so on, right? So the vector is, so how do I go from the vector of commodities to the vector of characteristic? Through a matrix, right? Because in general, there will be a matrix C composed of what? composed of a finite number of, well, row or columns, it depends, let's make it finite number of columns and infinite number of rows. The columns is going to be the characteristics column from 1 to, what did I use? I, N, I think. Yeah, let me call this I. Okay? And here I list the commodities. Commodity 1, commodity 2, 3, 4, I plus 1, so the infinite number of rows. And here what do I have? I have characteristic 1 of commodity 1, characteristic row 2 of commodity, characteristic commodity 1, characteristic 3 of commodity 1, characteristic N of commodity 1. Okay? How do I go from a vector X into a vector of commodities? How do I go from a vector of commodities X to a vector of characteristics C consumed at time t? By post multiplying the matrix by the vector.